From major social media platforms suddenly disappearing from millions of phones overnight, to internet memes landing people in legal trouble simply for using someone's face, and even something as ordinary as lace underwear being banned. This is everything banned in Russia, showing just how far restrictions can reach. Jehovah's Witnesses. For decades, Jehovah's Witnesses quietly practiced their religion across Russia. They held Bible study meetings in private homes, gathered in kingdom halls for worship, and spent weekends going door to door with religious pamphlets. The group had existed in Russia for generations, even surviving harsh repression during the Soviet Union. But in the 2010s, Russian authorities began looking at the group very differently. Officials started accusing Jehovah's Witnesses of spreading extremist ideology. The reasoning was strange to many observers, as prosecutors argued that some of the group's religious texts claimed their beliefs were the only true form of Christianity, which the government said could promote religious superiority. At first, the pressure was small as courts began banning certain publications. Local congregations were fined, and police occasionally showed up at worship meetings to question people. But in 2017, the pressure turned into a full ban as that year, Russia's Supreme Court made a decision that shocked human rights organizations around the world. In Russia, that label usually belongs to terrorist groups and violent political movements. The ruling immediately outlawed the entire religion's organizational structure in the country. Nearly 400 local branches were shut down overnight, while their property was seized by the state. From that moment on, something as simple as reading the Bible together could technically be treated as extremist activity for Jehovah's Witnesses. Police began raiding homes where believers gathered for prayer meetings. Some members were arrested while others were interrogated for hours about their religious practices.
Они хотели незаконно меня сейчас лишить свободы и отправить, доставить в психиатрическую больницу. Это является одним из методов репрессий. То есть на меня хотят психологически надавить, но если бы не было здесь камер и столько людей, то разговор был бы по-другому.
In several cases, people were sentenced to years in prison simply for continuing to meet with fellow worshippers. Their crime was practicing a religion that the state had suddenly decided was illegal. But banning one religious group was only the beginning. The international LGBT movement. This time, the government moved beyond one church or institution and aimed at something far broader. In November 2023, Russia's Supreme Court ruled that what it called the international LGBT movement should be classified as an extremist organization. There was just one strange detail. No official group with that name actually existed. There were no headquarters, leadership, or membership lists. But despite that, the court declared the movement extremist and banned its activities across the country. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to look at how Russia defines extremism. Under Russian law, participating in an extremist organization can carry serious criminal penalties. People can face large fines, years in prison, and surveillance by security services. So once the ruling took effect, any organized advocacy connected to LGBT rights could potentially fall under extremist law. Activist groups shut down, community organizations disappeared, and public events supporting LGBT rights became legally dangerous. Even displaying certain symbols or organizing online communities could attract attention from authorities. Over the years, Russia has been tightening the rules around LGBT issues. Earlier laws banned what the government called gay propaganda, especially anything about LGBT identities that could reach minors. But in 2023, the government went even further, expanding those restrictions beyond minors to adults as well. It officially labeled the LGBT rights movement as extremist. That meant activism around LGBT rights could now be treated the same way as other extremist activities. The problem is, the government never clearly defined what counts as the movement, so the line between simply expressing yourself and breaking the law became very unclear. However, this was only the beginning to rules that stretched beyond the country's borders. The Undesirable Organizations Law. In 2015, the Russian government introduced a law that created a completely new category of banned organizations. It was called the Undesirable Organizations Law. If the Russian government believes a foreign organization threatens the country's constitutional order, defense, or security, it can officially declare that organization undesirable. But the consequences go far beyond just banning the group itself. Once an organization is placed on the undesirable list, almost any connection to it becomes illegal inside Russia. Russian citizens are forbidden from cooperating with it. They cannot work with it, receive funding from it, distribute its materials, or even help organize events connected to it. Even sharing the organization's content online can lead to legal trouble. The law was initially presented as a way to protect Russia from foreign political influence. Officials argued that some international NGOs were interfering in domestic politics or trying to destabilize the government. But in practice, the list quickly expanded to include a wide range of organizations. Many of them focused on journalism, democracy promotion, or human rights. Groups that had previously operated openly in Russia suddenly found themselves completely banned. their offices shut down, their staff forced to leave the country, and their local partners placed at legal risk. And for Russian citizens, the law created a dangerous new reality, as repeat violations could even lead to prison sentences. One well-known example is the human rights organization Amnesty International. In 2025, Russian authorities declared the group an undesirable organization, effectively outlawing its work inside the country. Over time, the undesirable organizations list has grown steadily, covering dozens of foreign NGOs and institutions. The result is a powerful legal tool that allows the Russian government to cut off connections between its citizens and certain international organizations almost instantly. Once a group is labeled undesirable, it effectively disappears from Russian public life, and anyone who continues interacting with it risks being treated as if they're cooperating with a banned organization. However, banning movements is only one form of control. Next comes the place where millions of people actually talk: the internet. Facebook and Instagram ban. For many years, Russians used Western social media platforms just like the rest of the world. People shared photos on Instagram, followed celebrities and news pages on Facebook, and used both platforms for business, art, and everyday communication. By 2021, Instagram alone had become one of the most influential social platforms in the country. Russian influencers built huge audiences there. Online stores used Instagram pages as their main storefront, and bloggers used the platform to advertise everything from clothing brands to restaurants. But in 2022, access to those platforms was disrupted almost overnight. That year, the Russian government made a dramatic move against the company behind both platforms, Meta Platforms. Russian prosecutors said the company had allowed posts encouraging violence against Russian soldiers after the invasion of Ukraine began. The case quickly moved through the courts. On March 21, 2022, the Tverskoy District Court ruled that Meta was engaged in extremist activity. The court officially declared the company an extremist organization and banned its operations in Russia. In Russia, that label carries enormous legal weight. The same classification is used for organizations the state considers serious threats to national security. The ruling had immediate consequences. Both Facebook and Instagram were effectively banned across the country. Russian internet providers began blocking access to the platforms under orders from the national communications regulator Roskomnadzor, which had already restricted Facebook earlier that month. Access to Instagram was shut down at midnight on March 14, 2022, after regulators announced that users would be given a short period to transfer their photos and data to other platforms before the block took effect. For millions of users, their social media accounts suddenly became inaccessible. Many influencers and businesses moved their audiences to VK, Russia's largest domestic social network. Others shifted to Telegram and WhatsApp, where bloggers and journalists began running large public channels to reach followers. One major exception remained. Although it is owned by Meta, WhatsApp was not included in the extremist designation because Russian authorities classified it as a private messaging service rather than a public broadcasting platform. And when removing a platform wasn't possible, it was made extremely slow. Twitter restrictions. For years, Twitter, now known as X, was one of the few Western social media platforms that remained widely accessible in Russia. Journalists shared breaking news there, activists organized discussions, and everyone from politicians to ordinary users weighed in on daily events. Several Russian newsrooms relied heavily on Twitter threads to distribute articles and real-time updates during protests or political developments. But the relationship between Twitter and the Russian government had been tense for a long time. Russian regulators, particularly the federal communications watchdog, Roskomnadzor, repeatedly demanded that the platform remove certain posts, accounts, and topics they claimed violated national news. These included political criticism, protest information, and content authorities said promoted drugs, child pornography, suicide, or extremism. However, Twitter didn't always comply. According to Russian officials, the platform had ignored over 28,000 government requests to remove specific content. Regulators warned repeatedly that failure to follow Russian internet laws could lead to penalties or technical restrictions. In March 2021, authorities responded with something users noticed immediately. Instead of blocking the site completely, regulators began throttling Twitter's speed across the country, which is a subtle but powerful method of control. The website still technically works, but pages take much longer to load. Images may appear slowly or not at all. Videos might refuse to play and notifications arrive late. In Twitter's case, Russian telecom providers were instructed to slow down the delivery of images and multimedia content from Twitter's domain. Since much of the platform depends on photos, videos, and embedded media, the slowdown affected large portions of the site. The result was an internet experience that felt frustrating and unreliable. For many users, the slowdown made Twitter difficult enough to use that they gradually abandoned it. 46% of teenagers reported anger over internet restrictions. 15% said they cried. 14% felt confusion or irritation. 7% expressed disgust or hatred, and 6% reported shock. And another user directed his discontentment at the Russian president. Not that Putin himself uses it, or the internet at all. Boring, but thinks it makes him super epic. Some journalists who previously posted breaking updates on Twitter began shifting their reporting to Telegram channels instead, where posts could reach subscribers instantly without interference. Independent media outlets like Medusa Live that once relied on Twitter threads for audience engagement increasingly focused on Telegram, VK, and YouTube to distribute content. Activists and bloggers also migrated discussions to large Telegram groups where conversations could still spread quickly. Authorities described the throttling as a punishment for Twitter's refusal to remove banned content, but the technical slowdown had a clear practical effect. Yet, when people tried finding ways around those restrictions, the government moved to close those doors too. VPN services. Whenever websites get blocked, people usually look for ways around it, and one of the most common tools for doing that is a VPN, which stands for Virtual Private Network. A VPN reroutes your connection through another country, making blocked sites easier to access. So if a platform like Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter is restricted inside Russia, a VPN can often restore access within seconds. And for a while, many Russians relied on these tools to keep using the global internet, but authorities quickly noticed, over the past several years, the Russian government has steadily moved to restrict VPN services themselves. Regulators demanded that VPN companies cooperate with state censorship systems and block the same websites that Russian internet providers were required to block. According to a Russian lawmaker, Sergei Buyarsky, if you live with a VPN switched on, you can access corners of the internet that are best avoided. However, some companies refused. They did. The government responded by blocking those VPN services entirely. Major providers like ExpressVPN and NordVPN became increasingly difficult to access after regulators moved against them. Officials argued the measures were necessary to prevent people from bypassing laws designed to control illegal or extremist content. Critics, however, say the goal is much broader. By limiting VPN access, authorities make it far harder for ordinary citizens to reach websites that exist outside Russia's lightly controlled digital environment. And once online speech was restricted, attention shifted to something older than the internet: culture itself, anti-government music, and political art. In modern Russia, music has become one of the fastest ways to draw government attention. In the first 9 months of 2023, more than 4,000 songs, performances, and music videos have been restricted, removed from Yandex Online, or quietly discouraged from public circulation. Much of the enforcement happens through Russia's communications regulator, Roskomnadzor, which can demand that streaming platforms remove material considered extremist or illegal. Platforms operating inside Russia must comply or risk fines and blocking orders. Sometimes the restrictions happen online. Streaming services such as Spotify, YouTube, and the Russian platform VK have removed tracks or limited access to certain music after receiving regulatory complaints. Songs associated with the Ukraine invasion, protest movements, or opposition figures are particularly vulnerable to removal. Other times, censorship happens in the physical world. Concert venues frequently cancel performances due to the pressure from local authorities. Regional governments and police departments warn venues that hosting certain performers could violate public order laws. Because of this, festivals have removed artists from their lineups shortly before events begin. Several well-known performers have been directly affected. Members of the protest art collective Pussy Riot were arrested in 2012 after performing an anti-government punk protest inside Moscow's Cathedral of Christ the Savior. 2 members, Nadezhda Tolokonikova and Maria Alyukina, were sentenced to prison for hooliganism motivated by religious hatred, turning the case into one of the most internationally known examples of Russian political art repression. More recently, rappers and rock musicians have faced concert bans. In 2018 and 2019, regional authorities canceled multiple performances by artists such as Husky after complaints about lyrics and imagery. When police shut down one of his shows in Krasnodar, Husky climbed onto a parked car outside the venue and performed songs for fans before being detained by police. Other performers chose to leave the country after criticizing the war in Ukraine. Rock singer Andrei Makarovich publicly opposed the invasion and later relocated abroad. Meanwhile, rapper Oxymiron canceled a series of concerts inside Russia and instead organized anti-war charity performances in cities such as Berlin and London. Authorities rarely describe these actions as censorship. Instead, they frame them as measures to prevent extremism, protect public order, or stop the spread of illegal information. But the consequences for musicians are clear. Artists who openly criticize the government risk losing venues, tour permits, streaming distribution, and broadcast exposure inside Russia. Some have stopped performing political material. Others continue releasing music from outside the country, where their work can circulate online without the same restrictions. While musicians face pressure for their lyrics, writers soon discovered their stories could be targeted too. Books with LGBT themes. For years, years, Russian bookstores and libraries openly carried books exploring LGBT identities and relationships. The change came after Russia expanded its laws banning what officials call LGBT propaganda. Originally introduced in 2013 under President Vladimir Putin, the law prohibited public messaging about LGBT identities if it could be accessed by minors. The legislation was formally titled The Law Against the Propaganda of Non-Traditional Sexual Relations. At the time, the rule mainly affected advertising, media, and public demonstrations, but in December 2022, Russia's parliament, the State Duma, passed sweeping amendments expanding the ban to all audiences, not just minors. The legislation was signed into law by Vladimir Putin and took effect immediately. It prohibits any public materials that portray or promote non-traditional sexual relations, including books, films, advertising, and online content. Violations can lead to heavy financial penalties. Under the law, individuals can be fined up to 400,000 rubles, while companies can face fines of up to 5 million rubles. Foreign citizens accused of violating the law can be detained and expelled from the country. Once the law changed, bookstores, publishers, and libraries faced a difficult situation. Many works of literature suddenly risked being interpreted as violating propaganda laws. And because the penalties could include large fines or legal consequences, businesses often chose the safest option, removing the books entirely. Across the country, reports began emerging of stores quietly pulling certain titles from the displays. One of Russia's largest book distributors, Exmo ASD, reportedly instructed bookstores to review and remove titles that could potentially violate the propaganda law. Libraries and schools also began reviewing their collections. Books that featured LGBT characters or themes were sometimes placed in restricted sections or removed entirely to avoid legal risk. Some universities quietly limited access to certain academic works in gender studies and sexuality. Publishers also began canceling or postponing projects. Translations of foreign novels featuring LGBT characters were delayed. Some Russian authors reported that editors asked them to remove LGBT storylines entirely before publication. However, the restrictions go beyond printed books. Roskomnadzor also has ordered the removal of online content that violates the propaganda law. Online bookstores, digital libraries, and audiobook platforms have been required to block or restrict certain titles inside Russia. In many cases, the books affected by these restrictions were not political works at all, but fiction wasn't the only thing disappearing from shelves. Books tied to political opposition followed. Alexei Navalny's memoir and related works. Opposition leader Alexei Navalny became one of the most prominent critics of the Russian government, known for investigations and viral videos accusing top officials of corruption through his group, the Anti-Corruption Foundation. One of the group's most widely viewed investigations was the 2021 documentary, Putin's Palace. Released on YouTube shortly after Navalny returned to Russia and was arrested, the video accused Vladimir Putin of secretly benefiting from a massive Black Sea estate. The investigation was viewed more than 100 million times within weeks, making it one of the most widely watched political videos in Russian internet history. That attention soon extended to books as well. Memoirs, biographies, and investigative works connected to Navalny began appearing in bookstores, offering readers insight into his political movement, anti-corruption investigations, and clashes with authorities. One of the most notable titles is Patriot, Navalny's memoir describing his political activism, investigations, poisoning, and imprisonment. The book attracted intense international interest following his death in prison in 2024 and quickly became a bestseller in several Western countries. Other works about Navalny include biographies written by journalists and political analysts, examining his rise as the most prominent opposition figure in Russia since the early 2010s. But as tensions between Navalny and the government escalated, those publications increasingly became targets themselves. In June 2021, the Moscow City Court ruled that Navalny's organizations, including the Anti-Corruption Foundation and his nationwide political network, were extremist organizations. That classification placed them in the same legal category used for terrorist groups and other banned movements. Under Russian law, distributing materials associated with extremist organizations can carry serious legal consequences. Individuals can face fines of up to 3,000 rubles or up to 15 days of arrest for financing, organizing, or promoting such groups. Once the ruling took effect, materials connected to Navalny entered a far riskier legal category. Publishers, bookstores, and libraries suddenly faced the possibility that distributing certain texts could be interpreted as promoting banned organizations. The result was a quiet but noticeable disappearance. Bookstores removed some titles from their shelves, while libraries restricted access to others. Some publishers halted new print runs entirely to avoid legal complications. Roskomnadzor also increased monitoring of online materials related to Navalny's movement, including digital publications and investigative reports. Academic institutions became cautious as well. Public discussions referencing Navalny's investigations or political organizations began disappearing from conferences and public lectures, as universities sought to avoid association with banned groups. And from there, the the restrictions widened even further to include entire national voices, Ukrainian and anti-war literature. When Russia launched its large-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the conflict didn't just reshape geopolitics, it also affected what people inside Russia could read. Libraries and bookstores reviewed titles linked to Ukraine or the war, avoiding works seen as criticizing the military or supporting Ukraine. Some removed Ukrainian authors, while publishers like AST Publishing and Exmo reviewed sensitive titles. Major bookstore chain Chitaigorod faced scrutiny over politically sensitive books, works of fiction, poetry, and historical analysis that had previously been part of ordinary library collections suddenly became politically sensitive. Some institutions quietly placed these titles into storage, others removed them from catalogs altogether. At the same time, books written by Russian authors who openly opposed the war also faced growing restrictions. Publishers considered releasing manuscripts that criticized the conflict, public readings were canceled, and discussions about the war in literary festivals became increasingly rare. Officially, many of these changes were framed as compliance with new laws against spreading what authorities call false information about the military. In one case, the publisher Individum faced legal pressure over the novel Summer in a Pioneer Tie by Elena Malasova and Katerina Silvanova, forcing the company to cancel events and handle sensitive titles more cautiously. Under those laws, public statements that challenge the government's official narrative about the war can lead to serious penalties. Because of that risk, many libraries and bookstores prefer not to stock or display books that might attract attention from regulators, yet censorship didn't stop at politics. Even the words artists use can now break the law. The Mat ban, profanity in media. Russian culture has a long and deeply rooted tradition of strong language. In fact, Russian language contains a category of extremely explicit swear words known collectively as mat, Russian profanity. These words aren't just casual insults, they carry cultural weight, often used in street speech, literature, and music, and underground art as a form of raw expression. For decades, mat appeared openly in certain artistic spaces. It showed up in Soviet-era samizdat literature, post-Soviet rock music, and theater performances that leaned into realism and social critique. But in 2014, the Russian government introduced a law that changed how those words could appear in public media. Legislation banned the use of specific explicit profanity in films, television programs, theater productions, music recordings, and public performances that are officially distributed. From that point, anything using banned language had to pass through state certification before release. Without approval, a film or album could be denied distribution entirely. Film producers began cutting dialogue during post-production to avoid losing release licenses. Directors were forced to rewrite scripts so that characters no longer spoke in the way people actually spoke in real-life settings like factories, streets, or military environments. In music, the impact was immediate. Hip-hop and rock artists, genres that often rely on raw language, had to release clean versions of tracks for official distribution. Some independent musicians simply avoided mainstream platforms altogether, choosing online-only releases or underground channels where possible. Refusal to comply simply meant jail time.
Diana Loganova, who performs under the stage name Naoko, was arrested after playing a banned anti-Kremlin song during a public street performance.
One widely discussed example came from Russia's rock and rap scene, where many artists use mat. After the 2014 law banning profanity in films, concerts, and other public media, musicians risked fines if those words appeared in official releases. Artists known for explicit lyrics, including Sergei Shnurov of the band Leningrad, leading many performers to release censored versions of their songs for radio, streaming platforms, and live shows. Publishers faced similar pressure. Books with explicit language could still be printed, but they often needed warning labels, special placements in stores, or edited versions to reduce risk. Officials said the goal was to protect public morality and keep media appropriate for families and younger audiences. But for many artists and critics, the impact was clear. But government control isn't limited to culture. It also reaches into business, transportation, and everyday commerce. Cars with tinted windows. For most drivers, window tinting is just a comfort feature. It reduces heat, blocks sunlight, and adds privacy. In Russia, however, it's treated as a safety issue rather than a personal preference. Federal traffic rules require the front windshield and front side windows to meet strict light transmission standards, meaning enough light must pass through for the interior to remain visible. If the tint is darker than the legal limit, drivers can be fined in order to remove it. This enforcement is handled by the traffic police under the State Road Safety Inspectorate. Officers can stop vehicles during roadside checks or routine inspections and test the windows using certified devices to measure how much light passes through the glass. If the windows do not meet the visibility requirements, drivers are usually fined and instructed to remove the tint. In some cases, repeat violations can lead to stricter consequences. A vehicle may be required to go through another inspection before it is considered road legal again. These rules were enforced more strictly in the early 2010s, as authorities argued that dark windows made it harder for police to identify people inside vehicles during traffic stops. The main focus is on the front windshield and front side windows, which must stay clear enough for officers and cameras to see inside. Because of that, checks don't just happen on the road. code. Cars with heavy tint can also be flagged during registration or inspections. Rear windows are more flexible, but they can still be illegal if the tint goes too far or is poorly installed. Even tricks like removable tint can be flagged. And if your car fails inspection, you might not be able to renew your registration. While drivers face rules about what their cars will look like, digital money runs into an entirely different kind of restriction. Using Bitcoin for payments, cryptocurrency sits in a complicated legal position in Russia. Owning crypto isn't illegal, but using it as everyday money is tightly restricted. As of 2026, paying for goods or services with Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency inside Russia is prohibited under federal financial regulations overseen by the Central Bank of Russia. Under current rules, cryptocurrencies are treated as digital property, not legal money. That means people can buy, hold, or trade them as investments, but they can't legally use them to pay for things. Even simple transactions, like paying someone in Bitcoin or using crypto to settle a debt, can count as a violation of financial law. If found guilty, penalties could include up to 7 years in prison, up to 5 years of forced labor, and a fine of up to 1 million rubles. The monitoring is handled partly by Rosfinmonitoring, the country's financial watchdog. Banks are required to flag accounts that show signs of crypto activity, especially when digital assets are being converted into cash. Regulators have also targeted the platforms people use. Foreign exchanges like Binance have faced restrictions for Russian users, including limits on certain currencies and trading activity. In response to sanctions and compliance rules, the platform restricted some Russian accounts and required stronger identity verification. Many exchanges now require full Know Your Customer checks, linking crypto wallets and transactions directly to a user's verified identity. Even so, crypto trading hasn't completely disappeared. Instead, many users rely on smaller peer-to-peer networks or informal online channels to exchange crypto for rubles. In the end, cryptocurrency still exists in Russia, but its most basic function, paying for things, has effectively been removed from everyday legal use. And even something as basic as what people eat hasn't escaped government bans. Ban on certain Western foods. In 2014, Russia introduced a ban on a wide range of food imports from the EU, United States, Canada, Australia, and Norway, following Western sanctions linked to Crimea. The enforcement was handled through Russia's agricultural regulator, Roselkhoznadzor, which oversees food safety checks, import licensing, and border control for agricultural goods. The restrictions covered everyday categories of imported food, meat, poultry, fish, seafood, dairy products, fruits, and vegetables. Once the policy took effect, shipments from the listed countries were stopped at customs, with many either destroyed, returned, or rerouted depending on documentation and origin tracing. In supermarkets, the shift was immediate. Imported European cheeses, specialty meals, and certain fruits like grapes and berries gradually disappeared from shelves. Store chains replaced them with domestic production or imports from countries not affected by the ban, such as parts of Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. Restaurants and food distributors had to quickly adjust their menus and supply chains, especially those that relied on imported ingredients for premium dishes. Some products later returned under Russian-made labels as local substitutes. Online grocery platforms were also affected, with services like Yandex.Lavka, Bitconos, Supermarket, and Ozone removing or blocking listings for restricted imported goods from their domestic delivery systems. The policy was officially framed as economic retaliation and a push toward domestic self-sufficiency in food production. Russian agricultural producers expanded rapidly in response, filling part of the gap left by Western suppliers. Still, the ban for imported goods did not disappear. Some continued to enter through unofficial trade routes and third-country re-export channels, but at higher prices and lower consistency. However, the control doesn't stop with websites. It extends all the way to the SIM cards inside people's phones. Sharing SIM cards. For years, buying a SIM card in Russia is a required identification. Mobile operators must register every phone number to a real person, usually using passport information. The registration itself was no longer enough. The authorities began focusing on who actually used the number. Under updated regulations, sharing an active SIM card with anyone outside immediate family became illegal. That included lending your number to friends, renting SIM cards to businesses, passing them to temporary workers. And the rules reach further than SIM sharing alone. Even forwarding certain text messages can now create legal problems. Many online services in Russia rely on SMS verification. Banks, delivery apps, social networks, and government websites often send one-time login codes to confirm a user's identity. Under stricter enforcement, sending those login codes to someone else could be treated as unauthorized use of the number. Telecom companies had to adapt quickly, as mobile operators are now required to closely monitor how SIM cards are registered and used. Numbers suspected of being shared or rented can be blocked, and companies that allow improper registrations face serious penalties. Violations can lead to fines of 30,000 to 50,000 rubles if the case doesn't reach criminal prosecution, while organizers acting for profit or linked to another crime can face up to 3 years in prison, and participants can receive up to 2 years in prison. Delivery services, tax companies, and small online sellers that often often relied on shared phone numbers to coordinate drivers or customer support. Some call centers previously issued a pool of SIM cards that employees used during shifts. After the crackdown, each number had to be assigned to a specific registered individual. Authorities argued that the measure was necessary to reduce fraud, scam operations, and anonymous communication networks, but the effect was clear. A mobile phone number in Russia was no longer just a contact detail. It had effectively become a digital identity, tied to one person and expected to stay that way. But the rules don't stop with phone numbers. Sometimes even sharing memes can cause problems. Memes of public figures. Memes are central to online culture, but in Russia they have sometimes crossed into legal trouble. Under Russian personal data laws, a person's image can be treated as personal data. That means, using someone's photo publicly without permission, especially in a mocking or harmful way, can trigger legal complaints. Several court cases have involved individuals whose photographs were turned into viral jokes online. One widely discussed example involved images of Vladimir Putin that were edited into internet memes and shared across Russian social networks. Courts ruled in some cases that the altered images had to be removed, reinforcing the idea that a person's likeness cannot always be freely used online. The decisions established an unusual precedent. A meme featuring a recognizable individual could be treated as unauthorized use of their image, particularly if it ridiculed the subject. Since then, similar complaints have surfaced involving public officials, journalists, and celebrities. Social media platforms often remove the content once formal requests are filed, partly to avoid legal disputes under Russia's personal data laws. This doesn't mean memes disappeared from Russian internet culture. The creators began adapting. Instead of using clear photographs of real individuals, many memes rely on drawings, exaggerated edits, or symbolic characters that reference a public figure without directly using their image. The joke remains recognizable, but the face at the center of it is often missing. Then the ban stretches to words and names, controlling what individuals and businesses choose to call themselves. Latin alphabet housing names. For years, many new apartment complexes in Russia used sleek Western-style names like Green Park, River Plaza, or Sky Towers. The names were usually written in Latin letters rather than Cyrillic, partly because they sounded modern and international. Real estate marketing leaned heavily on that image, especially in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, where developers were competing for affluent buyers. Eventually, lawmakers moved to stop the trend. In 2023, Russian lawmakers introduced restrictions that prevent residential developments from being officially registered using Latin alphabet names. Housing projects must now use the Russian language and Cyrillic script in their official documentation and branding. The rule mainly targets newly built residential complexes, which are often given distinctive names for marketing purposes. Developers can still promote a project creatively, but the official name must be written in Russian-style characters rather than English-style lettering. Authorities say the rule helps protect the visibility of the Russian language in public spaces. For developers, the rule required quick adjustments. Projects that were already being marketed under English-style names had to rework branding, signage, and documentation before official registration. Marketing materials, promotional banners, and housing registries had to reflect Cyrillic versions of the names instead. The restriction also fit into a wider trend. As of March 2026, Russian lawmakers have introduced multiple initiatives encouraging businesses and public institutions to prioritize the Russian language in signage, branding, and official communication. Apartment complexes were simply one of the most visible places where foreign-style naming had become common. And with a new rule in place, the skyline of new housing developments began sitting back toward names written entirely in Cyrillic. And if buildings can't use certain letters, parents also face surprising limits on what they can call their own children. Unusual baby names. Parents in Russia once had wider freedom to choose unusual baby names. One of the most famous cases involved parents attempting to register their son with this name, a bizarre string of letters and numbers intended to represent a phrase about biological objects. The case attracted national attention when registry officials refused to accept the name. Situations like that eventually led to a change in the law. In 2017, Russia introduced legislation that restricts certain types of baby names from being officially registered. The rules prohibit names containing numbers, punctuation symbols, titles, ranks, or profanity. That means children cannot legally be given names that include things like digits, mathematical symbols, royal titles, or words considered offensive. Civil registry offices are responsible for enforcing the rule. When parents submit a birth registration, officials can reject names that violate the law and require a different option before issuing the child's official documents. Lawmakers argued that the measure was designed to protect children from names that could cause ridicule, bureaucratic problems, or identity complications later in life. The restrictions mainly target extreme or symbolic names rather than uncommon traditional ones. Russia still allows a wide variety of personal names drawn from cultural, historical, and regional traditions, but the new rules established a clear boundary. Creative naming is still allowed, just not when it turns into something closer to a code, title, or formula than a real name. And some of the strangest bans reach even into everyday products. Lacy underwear. One of the strangest product bans connected to Russia didn't start in Moscow at all. It began with a technical regulation from the Eurasian Economic Union, which included Russia and several neighboring states. The regulation focused on something surprisingly specific: the safety standards for light industry textiles. One rule focused on moisture absorption, requiring underwear fabrics to absorb a minimum amount of moisture for hygiene reasons. Materials that trap sweat against the skin can cause irritation or infections. The problem is that synthetic lace, especially polyester or polyamide lace, absorbs almost no moisture. So when the rule took effect in 2014, many popular lace underwear products no longer met the standard. As a result, the sale and import of certain synthetic lace underwear became illegal across the union's markets, including Russia. The decision quickly attracted international attention, partly because of how unusual it sounded. Media outlets began referring to it as the lace underwear ban. The rule didn't ban lace completely. Manufacturers simply had to ensure that underwear fabrics met the required absorption levels. Many imported lace products vanished from shelves, forcing companies to switch to cotton blends or redesign them. In some countries within the trade bloc, the restriction even sparked small public protests. Demonstrators in Kazakhstan staged symbolic protests holding lace underwear in the air, arguing that the regulation was unnecessarily strict.
Why are you afraid of panties? She shouts. Freedom to panties as she's forced into a police van.
Despite the controversy, the technical rule remained in place, and for a period of time, a surprising number of delicate lace garments simply failed to meet the moisture standards required to legally sell them.